Welcome to episode 204 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I'm the host, Kim Newlove. This is part 2 in a 5-part series about poison myths and misconceptions. My guests are Angel Bivens and Dr. Wendy Stephan. They are both educators at poison centers. Angel is a pharmacist from Maryland, and Wendy is an epidemiologist from Florida. In this episode, we'll cover 7 topics. They are: Number 1, who staffs poison centers? Number 2, where poison center calls come from. We know they come from people's homes, of course, but where else? Number 3, the age range of individuals exposed to poisons. Number 4, labels. We're pharmacists, it's not that kind of label, but the question is, will you get labeled a frequent caller or a bad parent if you call a poison center often? Number 5, childproof containers. Are they really childproof? Number 6, we'll talk about which age group poison prevention education helps most. So, who do you get the biggest bang for your buck by educating? Kids, adults, tweens, teens? Let's talk. And number 7, last one, myth or fact. People don't get poisoned by things that taste bad. At this time, I need to share a disclaimer. Listener discretion is advised. Some of the topics we'll cover in this series include children putting weird things into their mouths, like things that taste bad, poisonings, injuries, and even death. These can be sensitive topics. If you have small children or impressionable individuals listening with you today, listener discretion is advised. Thank you. Now, let's dive in. We ended part 1 of this series with the myth that volunteers staff poison centers. Let's hear from Angel now. Who works at poison centers? Are the staff volunteers, or are they educated and formally trained individuals? Take it away, Angel.
So, yes, that is a huge myth. Folks will say, why would I call the poison center? It's just a volunteer and they're just going to send me to the hospital. But that can't be further from the truth. We have healthcare professionals on the phones. Immediately, like first person that says hello is
on the third ring
in our center, either a pharmacist or a nurse.
Yeah, and at our center, all of our folks answering the calls for South Florida are MDs by training. So that's interesting. In just our community, we have access to people with MDs. So around the country, that mix will be different, but you're going to be talking to a doctor, nurse, or a pharmacist who then have this additional certification called a C-SPY. So sometimes you'll hear us refer to them as spies, which they're not spying on anyone. Okay, that's not why we call them that. So it's certified specialist in poison information. So if you see a C-SPY after somebody's credential in the pharmacy world, you'll know that they work in a poison center, and they receive training on the job and ongoing. They have to keep taking a test. I think it's every 7 years?
7 years.
7 years.
And it is a grueling.
Yeah. We always see someone, and there's always some of our specialists with the books open on their desks between calls, and I'm like, oh, they're brushing up for their exam.
So yes, unlike getting your nursing license or your pharmacy license, to be a poison specialist, you do have to recertify every 7 years. And it's not just a local exam, it is a nationwide exam. So I'm going to learn about those coral snakes that they have down there in Florida. Okay. And the poison specialist down where Wendy is going to learn about the copperheads that we have up here in Maryland. And
Absolutely.
We're all going to learn about the scorpions that are out there in Arizona. And not to mention the pesticides and things like that they have in Iowa and in the Midwest and stuff. So,
and then in addition to that, just to jump in addition to the people you speak to on the phones initially, right, that parent or grandparent might encounter first, there's then the higher level, so that if the case is complex or critical, then we would be bringing in our directors and the toxicologists at the center, the medical toxicologists. My medical director is a board certified medical toxicologist and board certified in emergency medicine, to then really consult for free 24 hours for that complex or critical case. So it is sort of a multi-tiered approach where the level of expertise matches the need of the caller. And, our poor medical director, I mean, he's literally on call 24 hours. So he comes in the mornings looking a bit haggard sometimes. He was like, I was up 3 times, but the importance is that we are there to support not just families, but our medical providers as well as they face these complex situations or an emerging situation or new product or new substance of abuse that's circulating in their community.
Well said. And I love that you can escalate things. That's what I hear you talking about, escalate things to the next tier above you, somebody who just has a little bit more specific training. But I think it's important to talk just for a moment about where your calls come from, because we've talked about calls coming from home, but where else do they come from? It's not just one source.
Yeah, so the mix is a bit different around the country, but I think I know in Florida, about 25% of our calls do come from healthcare providers. So the call is initiated in the ED. So that would be, or from a hospitalist, someone who is managing a case, a poisoned patient. Those other 75% or so, the call initiates at home. We assist with triage. What do you need to do next? But for the callers that are coming in, our calls that are coming in from healthcare providers, we're assisting with protocol, like managing that poisoned patient, whether it's administration of antidotes, timing of antidotes, what type of testing we need to be running as they monitor this patient's recovery. Is it okay to discharge this patient? These are really critical questions that improve outcomes.
And, up here in Maryland, we, in addition to healthcare facilities, EDs or hospitalists, will get calls from paramedics, first responders right in the field.
Yes.
So we can go ahead and get the treatment recommendations right there at the time prior to them being even transported in. In addition, some kind of other areas, school nurses call poison centers a lot. Okay. Just all kinds of different things at all different levels of education. We get a lot of calls. Sometimes employers will call us, or occupational nurses, et cetera. Health departments will call us. So calls come from a variety of people. And that's actually part of the fun of being on the phones, is you never know what that next call is going to be.
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. But you can go from a child who, picked a dandelion and ate the dandelion to somebody who is completely unconscious because they had a bad day and they took, 5 different drugs, and, it's all they can do to resuscitate them and transport them alive.
I think that really gets to another myth, Kim, that we had touched on in our earlier discussions, this idea that, when you think of poison control, you think of pediatric emergencies, essentially, for toddlers. I would think that is the most challenging myth that we face as educators in the United States on poison prevention, is that basically if you don't have a child under 5, then you don't need assistance from the Poison Control Center. And that's just not true at all, especially if you look at the epidemiology of who's dying from poisoning in the United States. It's overwhelmingly adults. And so this is a missed opportunity for us to support people at risk in the community. So I feel like, yay, we're doing a great job with child safety. That's the good news, is that belief in people's minds is that, that we are for children gets us utilized by, I would say the vast majority of families have a sense that we're there to help for that. But what we're doing is we can be missing really important segments of our population, like people who use drugs, people who have really complex medical regimens for chronic health conditions, people who know their pharmacists well, right? Because they're taking a lot of medicine. And I'm sure as pharmacists, you're hearing all the time about potential mistakes that almost happened, near misses, and confusion with labeling and names and dosages and all these things. So we're there to back up people of all ages for medicine safety. And I feel like that's really one of these myths that we're just continuously battling.
We also want to kind of highlight the fact that, a lot of folks think of young kids, But we're also there for parents of tweens and teens. And boy, don't parents of tweens and teens need all the help that they can get, right?
And all the sympathy and love. Yes.
Yes, exactly. All
yes,
the
ma'am.
But a parent called me. I found 10 cans of computer dust off in my son's room.
Oh, scary.
Can you give me a logical reason why he would have that? So kudos to her to think, okay, I need somebody to go ahead and talk through with this. And we can do that for parents. Parents might hear their kids talking about something, okay? The name of something and say, what is that? That's the big thing with school nurses. They'll call and say, the kids are talking about, bath salts. What is that? And we can help with that. So again, we want parents of teens to know, pull out that, dust off that phone number for the Poison Center. We can help you.
And for those blessed souls who are caregivers, for people with disabilities, for older adults in their homes, for neighbors, we know in our community, so many people are caring in a volunteer capacity for neighbors, friends, loved ones. You need that support too. And I feel like sometimes we forget about caregivers. We work down here in South Florida with a group, AACY, the American Association of Caregiving Youth. These are children who are caregivers in their homes. They're the caregivers for the grandparent or for a disabled sibling or that type of thing. So I think sometimes caregivers can be invisible in these efforts, but wow, what amazing services they're providing under such tough conditions. So, caregivers can benefit from the poison control centers really on a pretty frequent basis. So it's not only about parents of small children.
Thanks for mentioning caregivers. I am the full-time caregiver for my adult son with autism. Before school, after school, through the night, everything. And I have mentioned this on the other episodes, probably all three that I have done with Wendy, Angel, and then the second one with Angel. I have mentioned that I am no stranger to calling 1-800-222-1222. It is programmed in my cell phone because I have a son with something called pica. And he has autism, but he eats non-food items. And he used to do it more frequently than he does it now. For example, he would go out and he would take a leaf off of a tree and he would eat or chew on the stem. And I didn't understand at first, well, what's going to happen here? Is he now poisoned? Should I watch out? And there was, you guys could probably say the same thing that my poison expert said, but it was watch out for GI upset and, things like that, vomiting. But no milk was given or anything like that. I don't know if he would have consumed it anyways, because he's kind of averse to certain foods. He limits his own diet. Anyways, being a caregiver is lots of fun. Never a dull moment for that either. But anyways, thank you for mentioning caregivers.
Yeah, and that leads us to another myth, actually, is not necessarily myth, but I would say a fear, an unfounded fear, is that for families or parents who have to call frequently, and whether it's, a situation like yours where you have a child who is going to be, or you have an adult child now who's been at risk for a long time, right? that risk period didn't taper off at 6, what was sort of what we would see in like developmentally typical children. So there is a fear among parents that essentially if you call over a certain number of times or you call frequently, that somehow you're going to be flagged. And that is not the case, right? So certainly we do have frequent users. Sometimes those callers have, either chemical sensitivities or they have mental health conditions that make them especially fearful, or they need a lot of reassurance about, different smells. They smelled something scary. They are worried about a chemical. Maybe they have OCD or some of these conditions that really sort of lend themselves to poison fears. So we're happy to provide those services. Those are services that we're providing. And if we weren't there to help, for those folks, they would end up in the ED, with really big concerns. And so we don't want that. So no, there is no flagging of parents. We are HIPAA compliant in the sense that we are not sharing information. Our services are confidential. And so we really want families to call if they need help, and individuals really call as many times as you need us. That's what we're there for. And we're not going to be the ones to judge you. We are there to provide clear, accurate information, even if what's going on is not only ill-advised but illegal. We're not really in the business of like busting anyone. That's not our role in the system.
There are parents that fear that they're going to be identified as bad
Yes.
parents. The cops are going to get called, things like that. I mean, how many times have you received a phone call like that where you've had to kind of talk somebody off the ledge? Like, we're not going to call Child Protective Services. We just want your child to not be poisoned. Right. You know, how many times have you had to answer those calls?
I would say that is a fear. And I always follow up with if calling the poison center makes you a bad parent, then most poison center staff members are bad parents, because many of us have had to write up our own children because they've gotten into something.
And it's not anonymous for us.
Right.
They know who we are.
But many of us have had to either write up our kids or, just use our knowledge to go ahead and treat our kids because they get into stuff. That's what kids do.
Mm-hmm. My worry more is not for the people who call and we need to reassure, because some people I'm not going to give my real name. We're like, fine, put Donald Duck. We don't care. As long as we can follow that case and link up your case if you end up in the hospital, that we can link the cases together. My worry is the person who just doesn't call because they're scared. They have this misinformation in their head that somehow we're going to cause a problem for them. We know this belief from our research is more common in our lower income families, also in families of racial and ethnic minorities. And then this is a legitimate fear in the sense that people know other people in their community who've encountered Child Protective Services. They've had bad experiences. Children have been removed from the homes, but it's not been as the result of a call to poison control, right? So, we kind of serve a different function in the system. We are not mandatory reporters. So I think that's a really important distinction for your audience. If there is something that is serious or a child is in danger, we will be referring that family into the hospital where they have a lot more resources, child protection teams. They have, one-on-one contact. They can physically examine the child. They can interview the families. All of this is what's necessary to determine if there is some sort of situation where a child is in danger. We do not have all those tools over the phone. So that's not the role we play.
I think sometimes people have been victims of biases from their communities. And I think that's one of the reasons that they feel that they're going to be reported.
Yep.
Can you, maybe each of you, explain a bias that you've encountered when it comes to poisoning?
I have seen in our community generally a bias against people who use substances and people with mental illness. I think in our society, when we talk about poison prevention, we tend to focus on children. I think because there's, obviously children are innocent or et cetera. It's not a child's intentional behavior that's causing a problem, et cetera. And it's been, I think, more complex sometimes to really reach communities where there's intentional drug use going on, or to reach people with mental health conditions that make them more at risk for poisoning. So, I think that's just in society, and that's things we're trying to fight against, and that we are there to save everyone's life. We're there to support people in their good choices, right? So even if someone is an active substance user and they call the poison center and they're concerned about combining things, we can give them factual information about the toxicity of, their situation so that they can make an informed choice. And I like that about poison centers. I feel like that's what we're there for. People retain control and can use our information or not as they see fit.
And I really don't have anything to add. I think that was very, very well said. And I would agree 100% with what Wendy just said.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to another myth or misconception. Wendy, I believe you already talked about this, or maybe it was Angel, about how some people have a misconception that poison centers are only for children and that poisoning is only a pediatric issue. And then you also just talked about people who have substance use disorders. Those are typically adults. So, there is a myth that it's only for children, yet in practice, you field calls from people who have substance use disorders, among other issues. So what are some other child-related myths that you know about when it comes to poison centers?
Oh, one of the biggest things is that kids can't open And what do they call them? Childproof containers,
Ugh.
which we have to dispel that whole myth because they're not childproof. They were never meant to be childproof. They're child resistant. The intent is to slow the kids down, right? And they've been around since 1972 or so. But they have never been intended to keep kids completely out. And kids will get them open if given enough time. And I would also say that kids are more in tune to not giving up and trying until they get it open, as opposed to an adult who struggles and say, okay, well, you know what, the headache's not that bad. I'll just deal with it. And they stop trying. Little kids view it as a challenge, and they can, if given enough time, can open a child-resistant container. They might not be able to do it 2 times in a row. So if you hand them the container and say, here, open this for me, they might not be able to do it again. So there's no such thing as childproof. It's child-resistant. And child-resistant containers do not replace the need for proper storage up, away, out of sight.
My favorite and scariest story that I heard from a family on that topic was it was a situation where a woman had taken over care of her siblings, of her sister's children, and she said that because of substance use disorder, that the child, a small child, she had seen her take a pill bottle, slam it against the wall with her wrist with one hand, and pop the top open because she'd seen her mom do it. Small child. And so that was one of the reasons they had stepped in, is because, children learn so fast, and they are fairly capable. They're watching everything we do. So that was a really extreme example of that. Another myth that has to do with child safety that I wanted to mention, and you talked about it earlier, you actually mentioned pretty poisons. One of the things we want to emphasize is if you want to do education to keep children safe, we really recommend that you aim that education not at the children, but at parents and caregivers, because we recognize there is some potential risk in showing the pretty poisons, right? So when their children get too small, showing the similarity between a pill and a candy and say, do you see how much these look alike? I mean, if you think about it, you can see the problem, right? Even if it's 1% of the kids, there's going to be some kid who's like, I'd never noticed that before. That actually looks interesting, right? And even though you're saying don't do it, that visual is very powerful, right? So all of those pretty poison type educational efforts, we really want to make sure those are aimed at parents and caregivers, and the focus is on their activities and keeping these things out of reach. If we're relying on the children to keep themselves safe, that really is the last sort of ring of protection, right? With Safe Kids talks about, barriers of sort of layers of protection. We really don't want to rely on the child making a good choice, right? It's our responsibility as grown-ups.
So to add on to that, a lot of times kids will be able to perform and answer questions correctly in an educational setting, but then left to their own decision-making, air quotes, they make the wrong choices, right? So in a classroom, they'll say, oh no, I would never eat berries off of a bush. But when they're on the playground and somebody dares them to eat the berries, they're going to eat the berries, right? Even if we teach them, always ask before eating or drinking something. And that is the message, not to tell the difference between what's safe and what's not safe. The message that we try to teach is ask first. Don't touch it, don't taste it, don't smell it until you ask a grown-up. And again, even sometimes that message is missed. That was missed eons ago with my own son. I hammered this into him, and we were at a birthday party and he was running around looking for me. And I was like, what's up? And he goes, well, they gave me candy. I want to know if I can eat it. I'm like, excellent. You asked me first. That's great. But then a couple, weeks later, we're at a swimming pool and I'm watching him and he reaches his hand into somebody's pretzel bag and helps himself. And I'm like, what just happened? You tracked me down and asked me if you could eat candy at a birthday party, but you helped yourself to somebody's food at a outside event. So they're not always consistent in following the directions.
And especially that exact situation is really becoming very problematic right now in the context of edibles,
Yes.
cannabis edibles, right? So, that brownie that I wouldn't have thought twice about at an adult party is now a potential hazard, not only to small children, but to teens and et cetera. And so I do think that the focus should be on caregiver responsibility. If there is going to be a party where these are present, then it's really up to the host and the person putting out the material to keep that safe. And I just want to shout out to Washington State on this particular issue with the cannabis edibles, in that the labeling in Washington on products with THC, particularly the stronger cannabis sort of compound, is a red hand with the words "not for kids," and underneath it is 1-800-222-1222. Right. So I just thought that was such a great approach.
Nice.
Right. And it did require that these products sold commercially are individually packaged by each brownie. So it's not 10 doses. So I thought they took a really responsible approach. So yeah, a lot of new challenges,
Yes.
for child safety. It's a moving target in many cases.
Right. And just to note, despite taking those steps, again, the internet, people can get, they can get stuff all over the place. So despite the fact that, here in Maryland, stuff is not supposed to look like candy, yet that's a majority of the cases that we have about edibles. So it's clearly not stuff that was bought here.
Yeah.
So we have to remember that the stuff is out there and you never know where it's going to be.
And the message on cannabis, I think, too, that we've been sharing is really that if you're choosing to use cannabis medically, that you should treat it with the same respect and caution that you would with any other, drug, any other medication, essentially, that it should be secured. The dosage should be very carefully considered. You should be consulting with your pharmacist about, mixing these with other substances, et cetera. So basically, moving it from an illicit substance into, a medical drug, like we do, like the way we treat everything else.
Yeah. Safe storage, right, is the thing. If you don't want the kids to get into it, you've got to store it appropriately and safely, and make sure that only the people that it's intended for are going to use it. And another, I guess, child-related myth is that kids won't eat things that taste bad. Really?
My son has eaten all kinds of stuff that tastes bad. That is not an accurate myth. That's not true.
Yeah. And that's what, parents will say. Well, I don't think he really got that much because it doesn't taste good. Parents have to remember that kids don't have a fully developed sense of taste when they're young. And so what tastes bad to an adult might taste good to a child.
Or just that it's interesting or shocking. I've heard from other parents of children with autism is that they will say that they'll see them actually repeat it just because it's very stimulating or surprising, or the texture is interesting. All considerations that, it might not occur to us as being interesting.
Yeah. What about that first drink of beer that you have as a teen or adult, right? You get beer face, right? But little kids aren't going to get that. Right? Because they're going to taste the sugar. That's going to be the forward flavor for their undeveloped sense of taste. And so they'll drink it and say, oh, this is pretty good. It's sweet. And they'll continue to drink. Okay. So again, we do not go by taste. If we're going to go by taste, it'll be a scenario similar to, okay, what happens when you feed him something at dinner that he doesn't like? Will he continue to eat it because you tell him to? Or will he refuse? At that point, we can maybe say, okay, if he didn't like the taste of it, maybe we'll believe you. But the fact that it doesn't taste good doesn't hold water for us. Kids eat all kinds of yucky stuff, and probably the yuckiest stuff that they eat is poop. Lots of poop.
Oh no!
Cat
the cat poop, the dog poop,
kitty litter.
It
fascinating.
doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I've not heard this before. We've never talked about poop on any of our other episodes.
We're breaking boundaries right here.
Yeah, I can't help being a little juvenile here, but I'm laughing. You say poop, I'm going to laugh. All right. So tell me about the poop calls.
Sometimes it can be concerning, right? Sometimes cats have illnesses and things like that. So I do not want to minimize and say parents don't call because it's a silly call. It is not. Sometimes they can result in things that we want to go ahead and medically follow up. So it's not a poisoning per se. It would be more of a medical thing. So, if they eat their own poop and they've just had, some sort of a intestinal virus or something, well, that's going to restart it all over again. Or, if the cat is not healthy or the dog is not healthy, it could cause a medical situation. So again, not to minimize the need to call us, but that just underscores that it is something yucky and kids still do.
No, and we joke always that if it can fit in the mouth, it will eventually end up there. So yes. With children, it's just all bets are off.
Oh, you guys have so many stories, but I think we should probably move on to the next topic, the next myth. Poisonings are always accidental. This is the myth. Are poisonings always accidental? That's a great place to stop. We'll pick up part 3 in the series with the answer to, are poisonings always accidental? Thank you for listening to part 2 of my Poison Myths and Misconceptions series with poison educators Angel Bivens and Wendy Stephan in honor of Poison Prevention Awareness Month, March 2023. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes for each episode in this series, you'll find the Poison Helpline phone number, which is 1-800-222-1222, links to resources and websites mentioned, social media links, and much more. I'll wrap it up here so you can move on to part 3. Thanks for listening and enjoy the series. Wendy, this is the bonus myth. Let's talk about the cost of using the Poison Helpline. What's the cost?
All right, so it's always free. There's been some misinformation out there that we really want to counter. I think it came from TikTok. My daughter, who was a TikTok user, shared this with me. Basically saying that, poison control is now charging, you have to pay. And it really stemmed from a misunderstanding where a caller had been referred out for a complex veterinary consult. They had been calling our services for a dog. And the people on the phones, as you know, are doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, not veterinarians. There are wonderful services out there that do charge up front for veterinary exposure. So we do frequently refer folks out for those services. But it is true, you have to pay for those. But you never have to pay for our services, and we don't want people to hesitate to call when they need help.
Awesome. Free, you can't beat that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the number one more time?
It's 1-800-222-1222.
Thanks, Wendy.